We've been talking a lot about esports already. Everybody was talking how the esports viewership is looking like, but most of the game that we heard about so far. Okay, I thought I have this one.
Oh, you have this one, okay.
Okay, right. So we've been hearing a lot about games such as Overwatch and Counter-Strike and Fortnite, those AAA titles, so big games, big companies. But what we haven't heard about is indie games and the performance of indie games in esports in general. So this is something I wanted to talk about. So indie games in esports. Right, so what I wanted to talk about first is how the indie games were always leading the way of games and genres. So starting from Doom, for example, 1993, one of the first FPS games that went competitive. Then we have Counter-Strike in 2000, a first mode actually that came from Half-Life that became a very sought-after competitive FPS game. And finally, we have an example of Vainglory, which is a first cross-platform MOBA type of game. So why esports, and what makes a game an esports? So most of the games feature these very simple steps. So this learning curve of every games is very simple. The games are easy to start, difficult to master. They have creative concepts, such as Hearthstone, for example. They are mostly attractive to watch. That's why most of the esports scene is built around Twitch streamers, and then they are moving towards bigger stages. Very often those games are free to play. They offer, they are very often based on achievement system. You don't have to spend any money, you can just keep playing, getting better and better and better. So, indie games are very often free to play simply because the developers don't have enough resources to create some very complicated systems. So they often decide to go with a very simple concept, but they do tend to try to make this concept as creative as they can. So it's easier for an indie developer to create a game that is very simple to master, very simple to start, and difficult to master, and attractive to watch. So let's move forward. What I also want to talk about is what makes esport games. There are three very distinct key features that every esport game have to have. The first one is competitive gameplay. You cannot have esport game without competitive gameplay or some kind of competitive features. The second is tournament technology. If your game by yourself doesn't have this kind of technology, there are numerous different platforms such as skills.com that can provide indie developers with the technology. So if you are an indie developer and you don't have this kind of technology, you don't need to worry, you don't have to spend much on it. You can simply implement it via platforms like Skills or Ease Games, which I'm going to talk about later on. And the last thing is viewing and spectating technology. That can be achieved in two ways. So you can have it on your own. For example, League of Legends has a very well built-in spectating technology, but simply streaming the game on Twitch is also a viewing technology and can be used to brighten the audience of your game. I want to talk about indies in esport because this is the main subject, and one of the most notable indies in esport right now is Vainglory, which is a cross-platform MOBA game, Rocket League, which is a very curious title. It's a sports game which features vehicular, I think that's the word, if not, correct me please. Vehicular type of gameplay, and Split Game, a quite recent game released last year. It's a simple FPS shooter, but it's very fast-paced, so it's found its way to a competitive esports scene. What I was talking about earlier are indie games in esports and how an indie developer can get into esports. What I also wanted to talk about is the mobile side of this, because it is a bit easier for developers to create mobile games. They can use already existing gameplay mechanics or concept and try to alterate them to fit their own sort of agenda. So when it comes to mobile games, what differentiates them from PC or console type of games is, for example, they do not require for you to pay a lot of money for hardware. You can play on your phone. Secondly, a vast player base of smartphone users, which reaches 3.2 billion users around the world so far. Smartphone games contribute to 36% of the global market in the year 2019 alone, and it's on the rise. And lastly, mobile games and esports are leading a gaming industry and are set to be worth over $189 billion by the year 2022. Sorry. So that's a lot of money to gain from it. Let's move forward. Oh, that's kind of got messed up, I see. Some of the big titles, such as PUBG or Call of Duty, are already transitioning from PC and console games towards mobile. We have applications that are based on Lite, so they are a lighter version of applications, so it's easier to install and they don't take much space. So we are currently seeing that games as PUBG Mobile or Call of Duty Mobile, they already sort of getting into the esports scene. And with the recent rise of Clash Royale as a RTS type of game in esports as well. But actually, let me show you, the fighting should be there on the question mark, so you can imagine. But there are some genres that are still untouched by any kind of developers, either indie or AAA. So, fighting games for mobile. Have you ever seen any esport mobile fighting game? Because there is none. There is a full potential of creating a fighting game for esports as an indie developer. So there are many different genres that can still be explored. Right. Previously, I mentioned that if you don't have tournament technology, or you're struggling because you're an indie developer and you don't have too much of a budget, there are skill-based platforms that can help you out with creating your own games and eventually to gaining your financial independency to focus more on creating interesting game rather than making sure that your game is performing well enough to make you financially stable. Platforms such as skills.com or easegames.com, they have their own free SDK, which they will gladly share with you so you can implement your own games into the platform. They will also provide you with valuable feedback, considering if your game is competitive enough, what can change, how the players are viewing, what's the retention, so all the important bits that you yourself might not be able to get because of your budget. Lastly, they take care of all the legal issues that you don't have the time or money to care about, because there are some things. There are some legal matters that you might just not know about, and it's their job to know about it and let you know so you don't mess up and don't get into trouble. What I also want to talk about is how skill-based games are performing with cash-enabled tournaments. So as you can see, there is up to 5 times day 30 retention for cash-enabled players as to compared to players who rather not spend any money at all. So it's a very interesting subject, because if you make your game competitive and you implement your tournament system. You maybe have some Twitch streamers. You basically make your game into an esport. And once a game becomes an esport, it's very often the case that people like to get good at the game, and once they get good at the game, they would like to make profit out of it. So what they can do is they can enter the skills platform, pick up your game, and they can try to play in tournaments for a prize pools, for example. And those type of players have up to five times the retention of all the others. So these are the ones that will be coming back to play your game. So to summarize it all, it's easier than ever for an indie developer to start your journey to creating your very first own game and to going into an esport industry. Considering how many devices and tools you have to start creating your games, it's really... Sorry, I kind of lost my thought there. So as I was saying, thanks to the skill-based platforms, developers can focus more on the game themselves rather than spending the time and money thinking about the ways of becoming financially stable or independent. So what you can do is you can create your own game. You can implement it on those kind of platforms, and you don't have to worry about anything else except for how your game is performing and how much players are, how much is the retention of the game. I think I covered it all, to be very honest, and we still have some time. So if you have any kind of questions, I'll try to answer them, but I can't promise.
Do you guys have questions? Yes, just a second. Coming for you.
If a game is being developed, and on that slide where you had the list of being easy to learn, hard to master, or the step, if maybe it doesn't fulfill all those criteria, isn't sure like if it's a game that could transition into being an esport game. What kind of things can they do to like test the water before?
The features listed, a esport game doesn't have to have it all. But most of the games that are considered esports have those kind of things, like 70% of them. So they are usually easy to start with, difficult to master. They are usually free to play, but they don't have to be. So if like 6 out of 10 of those points you can check on your list of your indie game, you're good to go. You don't have to do much, and if you decide to go with your game to those skill-based platforms, they will provide you with valuable feedback to what can you change to make your game performing better.
Would you look at, say, how it's performing on Twitch or those kind of platforms kind of first before thinking to invest in some kind of competitive scene, perhaps?
Sorry, once again?
Would you look at how it's performing on Twitch, say, if it's being played by a lot of people, then it's more likely that it could transition to an esport?
Usually the games that do well on Twitch are already considered an esport. A game doesn't have to have a lot of viewership on Twitch to be considered an esport or to be a successful one. Skill-based type of games are mostly mobile games, and as far as I know, there aren't too many Twitch streamers that are currently streaming on mobiles. But the difference is, not everybody can acquire a very expensive hardware to play your AAA titles on, but pretty much everybody got smartphones or iPhones. So even though so you can play it by yourself rather than watch people play it for you. So it doesn't really matter if your game is performing extremely well or extremely poorly on Twitch. It's rather about how many people are playing and how many people are enjoying it.
Do we have any more questions? Oh.
Good. Thank you very much for your attention.